The water in the Sub-Cellar Wash-Vats of Ironhold Citadel possessed a heavy, biting density that sank past skin and settled directly into the marrow. Marra Sterling kept her hands submerged in the lye-steeped basin, rhythmically pressing the coarse wool of the guards' winter tunics against the wooden ridges of the washing board. The deep, subterranean air was thick, smelling of burning tallow fat, damp stone, and the sharp alkaline sting of soap. Far above, muffled by tons of solid granite, the faint blare of brass trumpets signaled the arrival of the Alpha King's procession for the Solstice celebrations. She did not look up. Instead, she exhaled a controlled breath toward the freezing stone wall beside her vat. The condensation bloomed into a patch of temporary fog. With a raw, cracked index finger, Marra traced a series of sharp, intersecting lines into the moisture. It was a high Fenric root glyph, the ancient linguistic precursor for endurance under absolute pressure. She watched the freezing droplets run down the vertical strokes of the rune, studying the geometry of the dead language before wiping it away with the back of her wrist. Then she exhaled again, providing a fresh canvas, and drew the next sequential variation. There was no warmth in the lower levels of the keep, nor any pity. Her late father, Edward, had taught her that a disciplined mind was the only fortress that could not be breached by a royal decree or the bitter northern cold. To keep that intellectual fortress intact, Marra had developed a secret routine. She pulled a heavy linen bedsheet from the icy water, wringing it with a practiced efficiency that disguised her lack of raw strength. As the freezing runoff cascaded back into the vat, she tapped her swollen knuckles against the wooden rim, using the physical impact to deliberately count the syllables of irregular high Fenric conjugations. Tap, Veilthu, tap Veilthian, tap Veiltharum. Each sharp beat of her bruised skin against the wet wood grounded the ancient language in physical reality. The kingdom's elite had stripped her of her family name, burned her ancestral home, and executed Edward in the public square under false charges of treason. They had reduced her to a nameless, scullery maid, buried beneath the foundations of their thriving empire. That was the kind of invisible she had become. But they could not reach into her skull to extract the forbidden vocabulary stored carefully behind her quiet, observant eyes. She plunged her numb hands back into the murky grey water. The severe pain in her joint settled into a throbbing ache. But she welcomed it. It meant she was awake. It meant her mind was still calculating. The laundry detail was physically degrading, but it offered one vital advantage: absolute isolation. Down here among the dripping iron pipes, no one paid attention to a hunched girl in a stained apron. No one noticed that the rhythmic splashing of lye water perfectly matched the cadence of the oldest, most dangerous syntax in the sovereign realm. The heavy oak door at the far end of the wash vault swung open, its iron hinges groaning loudly and breaking the hypnotic rhythm. Two guards, dressed in the dark iron and crimson livery of the Vane family, stepped inside. They did not announce themselves with a formal summons, nor did they speak to the cellar master. They simply marched straight to Marra's basin, gripped her roughly by the damp sleeves of her coarse wool dress, and pulled her away from the washboard. She did not struggle or cry out. Years of harsh conditioning had taught her to lock away her emotions from unsympathetic eyes. She let her wet hands fall loosely to her sides, allowing the caustic lye water to drip silently from her fingertips onto the uneven flagstones as they marched her out of the cellar and up the narrow spiral of the service stairs. The temperature shifted drastically as they ascended, transitioning from bone-deep dampness to the dry, heavily perfumed heat of the upper royal estates. The guards dragged her down a carpeted hallway lined with imported tapestries and thrust her into a secluded, opulent corner study. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, instantly sealing out the chaotic noise of the grand wedding preparations echoing through the rest of Ironhold Citadel. Lady Cynthia Vane stood waiting by a massive marble fireplace, observing the crackling flames with deep, aristocratic boredom. The bride-to-be wore an exquisite gown of pale winter silk, her golden hair woven with fine silver threads. As Marra stood dripping freezing water onto the polished hardwood floor, Cynthia turned around, her perfect features instantly twisting into a reflexive grimace of disgust. Without a word, Cynthia raised a perfectly ironed square of white silk to her face. She pressed the lavender-scented handkerchief tightly over her nose and mouth, desperate to block out the sour, alkaline odor of the laundry vats that clung to the servants' damp clothes. "You are ruining my floor with your filth," Cynthia said, her voice muffled slightly by the expensive perfumed cloth. Marra remained perfectly still, keeping her posture straight but leaving her gaze carefully lowered to a safe point just past the hem of Cynthia's silk gown. She offered no apology, nor did she attempt to wipe her wet hands on her apron. She simply waited. Resting prominently on the mahogany desk between them was a heavy bronze case, securely locked and heavily tarnished with age. Cynthia gestured to the ancient object with her free hand, keeping the handkerchief pressed against her face. "The Solstice wedding is in exactly 1 day," Cynthia continued, her tone clipped and transactional. "The sovereign king demands that the covenant of the hearth be read aloud in the original High Fenric before the binding ritual can be completed. My father, Lord Vane, assured the High Council that I have spent the last 3 months diligently translating the scrolls to prove my historical worthiness to become his Luna." Cynthia dropped the handkerchief to let out a short, contemptuous sneer. "I have not, of course. The language is dead hideous and entirely beneath a woman of my station. But your father, the disgraced traitor Edward, spent his miserable life obsessed with it. I am told he taught you the tongue before his rightful execution." Marra kept her hands completely relaxed at her sides. She let the heavy silence stretch across the room, carefully calculating the precise geometry of the political danger standing before her. Cynthia unlocked the bronze case with a sharp twist of an iron key, flipping the heavy lid to reveal a rolled scroll of incredibly dark parchment. "You will translate this document in its entirety. You will do it flawlessly, and in absolute secret. If you fail by the deadline, or if a single guard hears a whisper of your true identity, I will have the remaining historical archives of Edward Sterling dragged into the courtyard and burned to ash." The threat hung heavily in the stifling, perfumed warmth of the private study. Cynthia leaned closer, her eyes devoid of empathy. "And after the books burn, I will personally tell the Alpha King exactly which traitor's daughter has been hiding in his cellars. Do we have a clear understanding?" Marra looked past the noblewoman and focused entirely on the open bronze case. She noted the extreme age of the metal, the specific flaking pattern of the green patina, and the faint, distinctly bitter scent of elder resin leaking from the ancient parchment inside. She did not tremble, and she did not beg. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. The Sub-Cellar held a chill that bypassed skin and settled directly into the marrow. Marra kept her posture rigid, hovering over the scarred wooden table. A single tallow candle sputtered in its iron holder, spitting the foul odor of rendered animal fat and damp soot into the confined space. Before her lay the locked bronze case, now open, and the ancient marriage treaty resting on a piece of clean cloth she had managed to steal from the upper laundries. The ancient parchment was stiff, heavy with centuries of sealed humidity, its edges crumbling like dried leaves. She studied it not as a simple servant would. She read it the way the late Grand Archivist had taught her, measuring the spacing of the glyphs, the depth of the pen strokes, and the uneven pressure applied by long-dead scribes. The scroll carried a strange, bitter fragrance beneath the dust, a sharp note of elder resin. She recognized the scent immediately. It was a preserving agent used exclusively in the deepest vaults of the High Temple, meant to keep volatile magical bindings from decaying over the centuries. A document intended for a simple marriage contract had no business being treated with it. A sudden northern draft hissed through the cracks in the masonry, a bitter wind that found its way down from the high peaks. The candle flame dipped, plunging the small room into heavy shadow. In that brief 3-second absence of yellow light, the text on the scroll changed. The ink did not fade into the darkness. Instead, it pulsed with a faint, bruised luminescence. Marra stilled. Her raw, chapped knuckles stopped their mechanical rubbing against her coarse wool apron. She leaned closer, ignoring the sharp ache, radiating through her lower back from hours of sitting on a backless stool. High Fenric runes were traditionally inscribed with standard iron gall or crushed charcoal. This pigment carried an unnatural, heavy luster that caught the ambient cold, emitting a dull crimson glow when starved of direct light. She reached for a clean, dry quill from her modest supply of stolen writing tools. With absolute, practiced precision, she scraped the barest fleck of the dried pigment from the edge of a ceremonial seal at the bottom of the scroll. The dust was infinitesimal. She brought the tip of the feather to her lips, pressing the microscopic particle against her tongue. The taste was sharp, metallic, and undeniably bitter. It coated the back of her throat with the distinct flavor of copper and crushed sulfur. Cinnabar. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. Cinnabar dye was strictly forbidden under sovereign law, outlawed generations ago by the high councils of the early kings. It was not used for treaties of peace. It was not used for trade agreements or border definitions. It was utilized exclusively for binding blood oaths, the kind of ancient, structural magic designed to enforce absolute, irrevocable submission upon the signer. Lady Cynthia had not delivered a document of mutual alliance. She had delivered a weapon, disguised as a wedding vow. Marra wiped her tongue with the rough linen of her sleeve, forcing herself to swallow the metallic taint to clear her palate. Her gaze dropped back to the glowing text, the implications locking together in her mind, like the gears of a complex vault. She began to dissect the syntax of the third stanza, stripping away the ceremonial pleasantries and flowery adjectives to expose the skeletal grammar underneath. The Vane family scholars had been exceptionally clever. To an uneducated reader, or even a low-tier record keeper, the passage spoke of united military strength and shared command across the northern territories. But High Fenric relied entirely on clause dependency and minute shifts in suffix structure. The root verb they had chosen in the binding sentence did not mean to share. It was a deeply archaic, conjugated form of the word to yield. If Alpha King Soren Thorn spoke these exact words at the altar on the Solstice, the ritual binding would activate the cinnabar. The phrasing would systematically strip his pack-mind authority, transferring the sovereignty of Ironhold directly to his bride. It was a silent, bloodless coup, drafted in a dead language, wrapped in the sacred traditions of the court. Panic was a luxury for people with safe homes and strong protectors. Marra felt only the cold, sharp clarity of a problem, requiring a structural solution. If she refused to translate the document, Cynthia would burn her father's ledgers, erasing the last proof of his integrity, and have her executed by dawn. If she translated it honestly and presented the evidence to the palace guards, a scullery maid, accusing the highest noble family of treason, would be hanged in the courtyard before noon. She picked up her small carving knife. The blade was dull from cutting kitchen root vegetables, but it would serve. With steady, methodical pressure, she shaved the tip of her writing, quill down to a needle-fine point, altering the angle of the nib until it was barely thicker than a single human hair. She could not change the primary, visible translation. Cynthia's retainers would check the bulk of the text to ensure it looked appropriately submissive and accurate to their forged intent. The defiance had to be entirely invisible. Marra dipped the altered nib into her own cheap inkwell. She began to draft the formal translation on fresh parchment, copying the treasonous clauses exactly as the Vane family intended, using bold, legible handwriting. Then, at the very bottom of the page, in the wide margin where the heavy wax seal of the temple would normally cast a deep shadow, she started her real work. She adjusted her grip, tilting the wooden pen until the split of the nib barely grazed the paper's surface. She wrote the correct, binding counter-clauses in a script so microscopic it looked like nothing more than natural imperfections in the woven parchment. It was a technique of archival preservation the former archivist had used to hide sensitive lineage records during the border wars. The tiny, subversive footnotes completely negated the yielding verb, redirecting the bloodbind back upon the usurper. If read aloud in the presence of the witness circles, the footnotes would act as a legal override, invoking the oldest covenants of Ironhold to protect the sovereign. It was a staggering risk. One wrong slant of the pen, one blot of cheap ink, and the microscopic defense would become an illegible smear. Her eyes burned from the intense focus. The dim candlelight offered almost zero assistance, forcing her to rely on muscle memory and the geometric rhythm of the ancient letters. She blinked away the stinging fatigue, keeping her hand locked in its rigid, unnatural posture. The cold stone of the cellar floor pressed up through the thin soles of her shoes, numbing her toes, but she ignored the physical toll. The true translation was no longer just an academic exercise demanded by a cruel noblewoman. It was a legal trap meticulously set. Tomorrow, she would hand this parchment back to the woman who plotted to destroy the kingdom, offering a polite curtsy and downcast eyes. But tonight, in the freezing dark, Marra Sterling held the entire fate of the Alpha King in her cracked, ink-stained fingers. The War Council chamber within Ironhold Citadel smelled of old iron, polished oak, and burning pine. Soren Thorn sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but utterly anchored. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. Across the scarred wooden surface sat Lord Vane, his velvet doublet pristine, his smile entirely too smooth for the border wars they were supposed to be discussing. Captain Caelan stood near the archway in boiled leather, his eyes fixed on the attendants setting out parchment maps. Lord Vane spoke of unity, detailing the upcoming Solstice wedding as a glorious bridge between their fractured territories. He gestured to the deployment ledgers spread across the table, his gold rings catching the firelight. Soren did not absorb the diplomatic flattery. The Vane faction had spent 3 generations contesting the Sovereign Court's military command, yet today the older lord offered no resistance to the northern deployments' schedules. He agreed to the troop integration numbers without a single counter-demand. This compliance was an anomaly. In the Alpha King's experience, sudden compliance from an enemy preceded an assassination. A servant poured a dark, spiced red wine into the heavy iron goblets. Lord Vane lifted his glass, offering a grand toast to the binding of their ancient bloodlines through his daughter Cynthia. Soren did not touch his cup. The sovereign let the silence stretch, the weight of his refusal pressing the oxygen out of the room. Lord Vane's smile remained fixed, but the muscles along his jaw tightened, a microscopic twitch occurring every time his gaze flicked toward the untouched wine. He was a man waiting for a trap to spring, anxious that his prey was not stepping onto the trigger. Caelan shifted his weight slightly. True sovereignty was the ability to observe the invisible machinery of a room, read the hidden calculations of your enemies, and dismantle their confidence without raising a single finger. Lord Vane set his glass down, his toast falling flat in the freezing air. Recognizing the audience was over, he excused himself to oversee the final preparations for Cynthia's arrival at the Grand Temple. When the heavy oak doors closed, Soren remained seated, his eyes fixed on the untouched wine. The easy capitulation of the Vane faction was a mathematical impossibility. They were surrendering their military leverage today because they believed absolute power would be theirs by sunset. By the time Soren returned to his private chambers, the midnight bells had tolled across Ironhold Citadel. He preferred the cold stone, the bare iron fixtures, and the scent of raw cedar logs burning slowly in the hearth. Tonight, however, an unfamiliar odor had invaded his sanctuary. Draped across the polished oak table lay the ceremonial bridal garments, delivered hours earlier for final inspection. The heavy ivory silks cascaded over the dark wood, intricately embroidered with the silver crests of the Vane lineage. The Alpha King approached slowly. The air around the garments felt stagnant. It was not the cloying perfume of floral oils that usually accompanied noble ladies. Beneath the superficial marsanking, there was something sharp, bitter, and profoundly old. He leaned closer, closing his eyes to isolate the olfactory threads. It was incredibly faint, buried deep within the tight weave. The fabric smelled of crushed earth, dried blood, and a toxic resinous sap, elder resin. Soren opened his eyes, certainty lodging in his chest like a splinter of ice. Elder resin was an illegal preservation agent, explicitly banned under the oldest covenants. Its sole purpose was to treat the brittle parchment of cursed blood scrolls, preventing the dark magic of cinnabar ink from decaying over centuries. There was no logical reason for the scent of a forbidden, dark magic resin to linger on a wedding dress, unless the owner had spent recent hours in close proximity to a bloodbind treaty. He did not summon Kalen. Instead, Soren searched the immaculate stitching until he found a single microscopic loose thread near the inner lining of the sleeve. With deliberate precision, he pulled it free. Carrying the tiny strand to his iron desk, he picked up a small brass oil lamp and lowered the thread directly into the heat. The silk sparked with an unnatural hiss. A thin plume of acrid greenish smoke curled upward, instantly filling the space with the sharp chemical sting of burning elder resin. The smell of oxidized copper and ancient rot was undeniable. Soren crushed the ash between his fingers. The disjointed puzzle pieces clicked together with structural clarity. Lord Vane's uncharacteristic compliance, Cynthia's sudden insistence on handling the ancient High Fenric Covenant personally, and now the chemical signature of a blood scroll preservative clinging to her garments. They were preparing a trap. The faction was forging a hidden clause, written in forbidden cinnabar ink, designed to rewrite the Sacred Union text and strip him of his Alpha Pac-Mind command the moment the vows were spoken. But Cynthia possessed neither the academic discipline nor the linguistic mastery required to translate, let alone alter, a complex blood covenant. She was using someone else. Someone skilled enough to forge the ancient glyphs flawlessly, and invisible enough to be eliminated without a trace once the treason was complete. Soren wiped the toxic ash from his hand with a clean linen cloth. The source of the elder resin had not come from the distant Vane estates. The garments had been stored within the lower vaults of Ironhold since their arrival. The scent was fresh. The forger was inside his own citadel. The heavy oak door of the sovereign's chambers clicked shut, cutting off the distant echoes of the upper keep's evening preparations. Inside the private study, the air remained still, warmed by a roaring hearth, but the faint, sharp sting of elder resin lingered over the polished wood of the central table. The ceremonial bridal garments lay exactly where they had been unboxed. Captain Kalen stood at attention by the entryway, his posture rigid beneath his standard iron breastplate. He had been summoned quietly, without the usual heraldry that accompanied a royal mandate. Soren refrained from facing the guard immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the heavy silk fabric of the robes. "The garments were delivered an hour ago," the king said, his voice low and measured. "Trace the exact route they took from the lower levels to this room. I want the names of every hand that touched them." Kalen offered a crisp nod and stepped toward the secondary desk, unrolling the daily transit ledgers. For several minutes, the only sound in the vast room was the stiff crinkling of administrative parchment and the snapping of the fire. Then the captain's hands slowed. He frowned, his heavy gauntlet lightly tapping the edge of the registry. "Is there an inconsistency?" Soren asked, finally turning away from the table. "Not an inconsistency, sire," the captain replied, his tone tight with professional frustration. "An absence. The upper-tier couriers are meticulously logged. Lady Cynthia's personal attendants signed for the final transport. But the origin point, the subterranean wash vaults where the ceremonial linens were pressed, is effectively a blank slate." The sovereign approached the desk. He leaned over the open ledger, his eyes scanning the rows of meticulously recorded ink. Kalen was correct. The upper staff had names, titles, and shift hours recorded with exact precision. But the section dedicated to the lowest levels of the citadel contained only broad, collective strokes. It simply read, "Scullery and laundering pool," followed by a bulk tally of copper coins distributed weekly. "There are no individual names," Soren observed, letting the reality of the ink settle into the quiet room. "The lower service corridors operate under a bulk contract system," the captain explained, sounding distinctly uneasy at having to admit a security blind spot to his king. "They are transients, cast-offs, refugees from the border wars. The steward's office does not record their identities, because they are not considered permanent residents of Ironhold. They are simply hands. Hands that wash, hands that scrub." Soren stared at the ledger. The architectural hierarchy of his own fortress had created a perfect veil. The Vane family, so obsessed with lineage and high-born status, would never look closely at the nameless workers in the damp dark. Neither, apparently, did his own royal administration. The lowest tier of the citadel was an invisible city operating directly beneath their boots. "The elder resin is highly restricted," the sovereign stated, his voice devoid of accusation, but heavy with tactical calculation. "It does not simply materialize in a laundry vault without a deliberate courier. If the Vaners are moving cursed materials, they are using the blind spots in our own registries to do it. I will assemble a full inspection squad," Kalen offered immediately, his hand dropping to the hilt of his blade. "We will sweep the lower cellars tonight." "No." Soren stepped back from the desk, his decision absolute. "A squad will make noise. If they are moving contraband, the sound of iron boots on the stairs will give them ample time to hide it in the drainage tunnels. I will go myself." The midnight bell tolled from the grand temple across the courtyard, its deep resonance vibrating through the thick glass of the study windows. By the time the final chime faded, the outer corridors of the upper keep had settled into a heavy, predictable quiet. Soren moved without haste. He unclasped the ornate ceremonial belt from his waist, leaving it draped over the back of a high-backed chair. Next came the heavy metal pauldrons resting on his shoulders. The royal armor was designed for intimidation and grand display, wide and imposing, meant to cast a massive silhouette in the great halls. Here it was a liability. He unfastened the leather straps with practiced efficiency. The thick iron shoulder plates hit the padded rug with a muffled thud. Stripped of the polished metal, the king stood in a simple dark linen tunic and dark trousers, his breathing slow and even. Without the armor, he did not look like a sovereign poised for a wedding. He looked like a hunter, calibrating his weight. Bypassing the primary guard detail required only patience and a precise memory of the patrol routes. Soren exited through the secondary servant's door, concealed behind the tapestries in his adjoining library. The air shifted almost immediately. The warm scent of beeswax and cedar that defined the royal wing vanished, replaced by the smell of cold draught and old stone. He began the descent. The main staircases of Iron Hold were wide enough to march a phalanx of soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, paved in smooth white marble. But as the sovereign bypassed the ground floor and moved toward the sublevels, the architecture began to constrict. The stone became uneven, pitted with age and slick with subterranean moisture. The torches were spaced further apart, their flames burning low and sputtering against the draught leaking from the deep drains. With every flight of stairs he descended, the ceiling dropped lower, pressing down on him. Soon the passageway narrowed so severely that a man of his build could barely walk straight. Soren understood now why the lower servants walked with a perpetual hunch. The space itself demanded submission. If he had kept his heavy metal pauldrons on, the iron would have scraped violently against the weeping rock, announcing his presence to the entire cellar network. Without them, he slipped through the claustrophobic tunnel in absolute silence. The temperature plummeted the deeper he went. The northern winter was brutal above ground, but down here, insulated from the sun and buried in bedrock, the cold possessed a different quality. It was a damp, bone-deep chill that clung to the skin like wet fabric. He paused at a juncture where the tunnel split into 3 archways leading toward the laundering pools. He closed his eyes and inhaled through his nose, bypassing the overwhelming stench of harsh lye soap, stale water, and animal fat tallow. Beneath the rot and the damp it was there, faint but distinct, the sharp, bitter sting of elder resin. It was not coming from the main washing vats. The scent trailed down the narrowest of the 3 corridors, a forgotten stretch of the archives that had been sealed off from regular use decades ago. Soren opened his eyes, his posture straightening slightly in the cramped space. He moved down the dark corridor, his soft-soled boots making no sound against the freezing, wet stone. The descent into the Sub-Cellar archives was a journey away from the warmth of the living. The stone steps were slick with centuries of condensation, the air thick with the smell of wet limestone and rotting wood. Soren Thorn moved without a sound, his heavy boots making no noise against the damp floor. The scent of elder resin, sharp and bitter, guided him like a beacon through the labyrinth of forgotten corridors. It was an unmistakable odor, used only to preserve cursed blood scrolls, and finding a trace of it on his bride's ceremonial garments had triggered an immediate, quiet calculation. He expected to find a nest of smugglers at the end of this trail, perhaps a treasonous guard exchanging contraband in the dark. He reached the heavy iron-bound door of the deepest vault. It was ajar, a single sliver of yellow light spilling onto the black stones. He did not push it open violently or draw his blade. Soren occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He merely stepped into the threshold and stopped, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The room was a freezing tomb, significantly colder than the upper courtyards. There was no fire in the grate, only the dying embers of a single tallow candle sputtering on a makeshift wooden desk. Hunched over that desk was not a smuggler, nor a rival lord. It was a scullery maid. She wore the rough, undyed wool tunic of the lowest tier of servants, the fabric thin and entirely unsuited for the subterranean chill. Her dark hair was tied back with a fraying ribbon, exposing a pale, slender neck, but it was her hands that anchored the sovereign's attention. The young woman's fingertips were stained a deep, undeniable black, iron gall ink. It glowed faintly in the dim light, a rare and toxic compound restricted to the binding of high pack oaths. The Alpha King stood perfectly still, his presence masking the draught from the corridor. He watched her work. It was not the frantic scribbling of a thief copying secrets, but the measured, agonizing precision of a master scholar. The cold was brutal, biting into the stone walls and leaching the warmth from the air. Her breath plumed in small, white clouds with every exhalation. She was shivering so violently that the tremors ran through her narrow shoulders and down her arms, threatening the stability of her quill. Instead of giving up, she brought her left hand up to grip her right wrist. Her cracked, water-damaged knuckles tightened, locking her joints into place. She applied a physical, bone-deep pressure to steady her own hand, forcing the tremor to stop just long enough to draw a single, complex high Fenric glyph. The ink flowed onto the parchment. Not a single drop was out of place. He did not move. He did not announce his rank. He merely witnessed the grueling, invisible labor that was currently keeping his empire from unraveling. The sheer discipline required to execute such delicate calligraphy in freezing temperatures was staggering. This was not magic. It was endurance. It was the quiet, brutal cost of unseen competence. He watched the cheap goose feather lift hover and descend again. The draft in the room suddenly changed. The constant, biting wind from the corridor, seat blocked by a massive physical form occupying the doorway. Marra Sterling felt the shift in air pressure before she heard anything. The atmosphere grew heavier, saturated with the faint, overwhelming scent of ozone, winter pine, and cold iron. She did not jump. She did not gasp. She knew the consequences of a sudden movement when dealing with wet ink. Very slowly, she lifted the quill from the brittle document and placed it into the groove of an iron rest. Only then did she turn her head. The king stood in the shadows, taking up the entire doorway. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control, but his pale eyes were fixed directly on the blood-red stains on her fingers. Marra let that knowledge settle into her chest like a stone, dropping through still water. The punishment for a low-born servant possessing a sacred scroll was execution. The penalty for tampering with the binding ink of the sovereign court was burning at the stake. She stood up, the wooden stool scraping softly against the floor. She did not smooth her apron or fall to her knees. Surviving the lower levels required an armor of complete emotional detachment. Instead, she looked at the heavily annotated sheets of parchment spread across her desk, then back at the towering man in the doorway. "The translation is not what they promised you," the maid said. Her voice was quiet, raspy from the cold, but entirely steady. It was not a plea for her life, but a statement of academic fact. Soren did not step forward to intimidate her. He remained at the threshold, waiting, allowing her the space to prove her claim. Marra reached across the desk. She placed her stained fingertips on the edge of her own draft and pushed it across the rough wood, orienting the document toward him. "Read the footnotes," she instructed, entirely bypassing the protocol of how one addressed a monarch. "Do not look at the primary text, look at the margins." The sovereign finally stepped fully into the room. The sheer density of his presence made the small vault feel like a trap. But he kept a respectful distance, stopping at the opposite edge of the desk. He looked down at the paper. "Lady Cynthia claims the third stanza invokes the ancient law of mutual protection," Marra continued, pointing to a cluster of dense, sharp glyphs. She kept her hand absolutely steady, ensuring he could see the correction marked in charcoal. "It does not. The high Fenric verb tense here is reflexive, but they have altered the root. They added a tertiary stroke to the symbol for alliance." She traced the air above the parchment, unwilling to risk smudging the wet ink with her sleeve. By adding that stroke, the translation shifts. It ceases to be a treaty of equal standing. It becomes a vassalage bond. The moment you speak these words in the Grand Temple, the oath will bind your Pac-Mind authority to the vain bloodline. You will not be their ally. You will be their weapon. She lowered her hand, letting it rest against her coarse apron. The silence returned, thicker this time. She had delivered the truth. Now, she waited for the executioner's verdict. She had no leverage, no status, and no defense other than the undeniable objective accuracy of her work. Soren stared at the charcoal corrections. He read the precise, immaculate handwriting that dismantled a silent coup in the margins of a stolen text. He did not look at her as a servant, caught in a crime. He looked at her as a tactician, assessing a newly discovered map, realizing that the only thing standing between his throne and absolute enslavement was the quiet integrity of a freezing, scullery maid. Soren Thorn did not raise his voice, nor did he demand the parchment she had just annotated. He simply stood in the freezing archive, processing the structural impossibility of a scullery maid, identifying the illegal use of cinnabar binding ink. Slowly, the sovereign king moved his right arm forward, resting his closed fist on the edge of the scarred wooden desk. The weak amber light caught the thorn signet ring on his index finger. It was a heavy piece of weathered gold, carved with a single complex high Fenric rune that most modern scholars claim to understand, though few truly comprehended its roots. "Translate the seal," Soren commanded quietly. Marra looked at the gold ring. The protocol of Ironhold Citadel was absolute. A servant must never make physical contact with the sovereign. She did not reach out. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, keeping her raw hands firmly clasped in her lap to preserve the required respectful distance. Her dark eyes traced the worn curves of the ancient glyph, reading the metal as effortlessly as parchment. "The central pillar of the rune is a locative modifier," Marra explained, her voice steady despite the condensation of her breath. "The High Council translates it as unyielding strength. That is an administrative simplification, and it is incorrect." Soren's expression remained perfectly still. "Give me the precise translation." "The upper curve modifies the root verb of endurance," Marra said. "It translates directly to the enduring weight of the mountain that shelters the pack. It is a covenant of protective burden, a promise to shield rather than to conquer." The precision of her syntax analysis left no room for doubt. No uneducated servant could pass the locative modifiers of a dead language with such exactness. "Who taught you to read the old tongues?" he asked. Marra kept her gaze fixed on the faint red stain on her own fingertips. "My father taught me, before the council ordered his execution." She let that knowledge settle into the room. She was Marra Sterling. Her father was Edward Sterling, the former Grand Archivist, the man falsely condemned for treason by the factions currently vying for power. She did not weep. Tears were merely a waste of hydration in a place where water froze in the buckets. "Lady Cynthia possesses the remaining crates of my father's research journals," Marra continued, her tone as dry as an inventory count. "They are the last physical proof of his life's work. She delivered the wedding scroll to me in secret. If I failed to translate it exactly as her family required, she promised to burn the journals and expose my identity." Soren processed the calculation instantly. The Vane family was utilizing the extorted labor of a condemned man's daughter to forge a treaty that would legally enslave the Alpha King. The name Edward Sterling hung in the freezing air, shifting the entire architecture of the room. Soren did not offer empty apologies for the execution of a man he had not personally condemned. Instead, he observed the violent trembling of Marra's shoulders beneath her thin wool tunic. The Sub-Cellar was practically a tomb of ice, the chill turning her knuckles a bruised, translucent blue. He reached up to the heavy iron clasp at his throat. The metallic clink was sharp in the quiet room. With a fluid, unhurried motion, he swung the massive dire wolf cloak from his broad shoulders. Marra stiffened, her survival instincts urging her to shrink back, but she held her ground. Soren stepped around the small wooden desk. He did not ask for permission, nor did he cross her physical boundaries. He simply draped the crushing weight of fur and dark leather over her shivering shoulders. The sudden heat of the garment was a physical shock. It trapped the meager warmth of her body instantly, carrying the deep atmospheric scent of crushed pine needles, cold northern wind, and the sharp ozone of the Alpha King. The weight of it was grounding. pulling her back from the edge of hypothermic exhaustion. As the heavy fur settled over her small frame, the thick hem threatened to sweep across the desk, moving dangerously close to the parchment, where the cursed cinnabar ink was still wet. Soren's large hand moved with absolute precision. He caught the edge of the cloak, folding the thick material back upon itself, and adjusting the drape with meticulous care. He ensured that not a single dark hair of the pelt brushed against her translation pages. He protected the physical preservation of her academic research just as carefully as he protected her freezing body. By leaving his personal cloak upon her shoulders, he was altering the legal geography of the citadel. Any guard or noble who entered this subterranean room would immediately recognize the garment. It was an undeniable declaration of royal protection, shielding her from Lord Vane's threats without requiring a single spoken decree. "You will finish translating the covenant exactly as Cynthia demanded," Soren said, his low voice vibrating against the damp walls. "But you will not give her the victory she anticipates." Marra looked up, her fingers instinctively curling into the warm edges of the thick fur. "What do you want me to do?" "You understand the mechanics of High Fendrick better than the traitors attempting to weaponize it," Soren replied, his gaze dropping to the glowing red script. "Embed a hidden counter-clause within the physical knots of the scroll's syntax. Use their own lack of scholarship against them." He stepped back, re-establishing the respectful distance between them. The cold of the room no longer seemed to bite into her bones. Marra looked down at the documents, the weight of the cloak pressing into her shoulders like a shield. The ink drying on the parchment did not feel like a tool of her extortion. It felt like the instrument of her vindication. The fire in the high solar burned with a wasteful, aggressive heat, consuming thick logs of cured birch that most border territories would ration for a month. Cynthia stood near the center of the expansive room, running a manicured fingernail along the edge of the ceremonial presentation table. She lifted her hand, inspecting a faint grey smudge against her pale skin in the bright ambient light. "The servants in this keep are entirely useless," she murmured, wiping the dust onto a square of white linen and tossing it toward the hearth. "If this is the standard they maintain for the Solstice signing, I'll have to replace the entire domestic staff by the weekend." Lord Vane did not turn from the arched glass window. He stood with his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his gaze fixed on the sprawling military encampments dotting the snow-covered valley below Ironhold Citadel. He was not thinking about dust or domestic staffing. He was counting. 3 heavy infantry banners from the Frostwood Ridges, the older man said, his voice a low, calculated hum. 4 cavalry units from the Eastern Plains, and the personal guard of the Sovereign himself, stationed directly at the gates. Cynthia moved toward a silver tray, pouring a cup of spiced wine. They look terribly cold out there. "By tomorrow evening, they will look to us," her father corrected, finally turning away from the frost-rimmed glass. He crossed the heavy woven rug, his boots making no sound. When the high priest binds the covenant, the command structure of the pack-mind shifts. The moment the king speaks the vow, the hidden clause takes root. The military will answer to the bloodline that holds the binding paper. To us, assuming the little cellar rat finished her task, she noted, taking a slow sip of the dark red liquid. The girl has no choice. Her father's journals are the only leverage she has left in this world. She will deliver the translation exactly as instructed, and she will keep her mouth shut out of simple preservation. He paused, looking at the empty ceremonial table where the scrolls would soon rest. "You are certain the text looks authentic?" "It looks exactly like the archaic nonsense Father Lucan expects to see," she replied, setting her silver cup down with a sharp clink. "I memorized the phonetic pronunciation for the 4th line. That is all the council requires from a bride. A brief, performative reading to honor the old ways, and then the ceiling. The aristocrat nodded slowly. He smoothed the lapels of his velvet coat, a gesture of absolute, systemic certainty. They had built a bloodless coup on the back of a dead language, relying entirely on the desperation of an invisible scholar they believed they had perfectly cornered. 3 floors below the high solar, the iron-banded door of the wash vault shifted on its hinges. The knock that preceded it had not been the sharp, impatient strike of a domestic overseer, but a measured, respectful double tap. Marra sat completely still. The heavy direwolf cloak rested over her shoulders, its thick fur radiating a deep, persistent warmth that had finally driven the subterranean dampness from her bones. The scent of pine and ozone lingered in the heavy fabric, a physical reminder of the king's presence in the freezing room. Captain Kalen stepped over the wet threshold. The guard did not carry his hand on the hilt of his sword, nor did he bark a command to stand. He took one look at the heavy royal cloak wrapped around her thin frame and lowered his chin in a stark, formal dip. "You are to be relocated," the officer stated, his voice kept low in the echoing stone chamber, "by direct order of the sovereign." Marra did not ask questions. Past hardships had instructed her that silence was the safest response to shifting authority. She stood, gathering the edges of the oversized fur to keep it from dragging on the wet floor. She reached for the small wooden crate holding her few possessions, the brittle parchment scraps, her father's brass nibs, and the 3 remaining glass vials of ink. Before her fingers could close around the wood, Kalen stepped forward. "Allow me," the captain said. He reached down and lifted the crate himself. It was a mundane gesture, but the execution of it was profoundly deliberate. The military officer balanced the rough wood against his armored forearm, moving with extreme care to ensure the fragile glass inkwells did not strike against one another. He treated the tools of her quiet labor not as a servant's debris, but as vital state evidence. "This way," he directed, gesturing toward the open corridor. They did not take the narrow, unlit spiral stairs designated for the scullery staff. Kalen guided her toward the inner keep's primary passages, walking slightly ahead to clear the path, yet keeping his pace slow enough that she did not have to rush. The architecture around them began to shift. The weeping limestone gave way to polished granite. The smell of lye and rancid tallow faded entirely, replaced by the clean, dry scent of beeswax, burning cedar and old vellum. They reached a heavy oak door stationed just off the primary wing of the Royal Library. Kalen produced an iron key, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the heavy wood inward. The study annex was not a grand, ostentatious room, but it was structurally perfect. A hearth fire already crackled in the grate, driving the northern winter chill back through the thick glass windows. A wide, meticulously clean oak desk sat in the center. Waiting under the warm glow of 3 oil lamps, Marra stepped over the threshold, feeling the thick woven rug yield beneath her worn leather shoes. Kalen set the crate of inkwells gently onto the corner of the desk. He stepped back into the corridor and placed his hand on the brass doorknob. "I will be stationed outside this door," the captain informed her, his posture rigid and formal. "No one enters without your permission. This room is now sovereign territory." He pulled the door shut with a quiet, definitive click, leaving her alone in the warmth. The dining hall in the high solar was built from polished black granite, lit by heavy iron chandeliers holding thick beeswax candles. The heat from the massive stone hearth barely reached the long oak table, leaving the air brittle and cold. King Soren Thorn sat at the head, cutting his roasted venison with slow precision. Across from him, Lady Cynthia Vane wore a gown of deep emerald silk, a calculated display of wealth against the harsh northern winter, pressing against the leaded glass. Soren set his silver knife down. The faint clinking sound echoed against the vaulted ceiling. He reached for his goblet, turning the etched glass in his large hands without drinking. He watched the way the candlelight caught the heavy jewels at her throat. She moved with the lazy confidence of someone who had never been forced to calculate the cost of her survival. The preparations for the Solstice ceremony proceed efficiently, he observed, his voice a low, unhurried rumble. Your father, Lord Vane, has been uncommonly generous in funding the temple's restoration, and you have taken on the burden of the sacred texts yourself. Cynthia offered a practiced smile, dabbing the corner of her painted lips with a linen napkin. It is my duty, Your Grace. The covenant of the hearth is the foundation of our people's future. I could not entrust its preservation to lesser minds. I have personally overseen every detail of its translation. A formidable task, Soren replied quietly. He watched the way she leaned into the praise, completely unaware of the absolute danger sitting across from her. The original scroll is remarkably delicate. Tell me, how did you find the phrasing in the third stanza? The transition regarding pack-mind integration is notoriously complex. Cynthia waved a manicured hand dismissively. It was tedious, of course. But once I adjusted the cadence to match our modern High Valley phrasing, the true meaning became quite clear. The ancient scribes were simply overly dramatic with their verb conjugations. Silence fell over the long table. It was not a sudden shock, but a slow, heavy settling of temperature. Soren stared at the dark red wine in his goblet. The High Valley phrasing was a colloquial trading dialect born 3 centuries after the original pact was penned. Applying it to High Fenric was not a scholarly error. It was a linguistic impossibility. I see, Soren said softly. He did not point out the glaring absurdity of her statement. He simply let her lie hang in the cold air between them. Your dedication is unparalleled, Lady Cynthia. I only wish to serve the crown, she replied smoothly, utterly blind to the fact that she had just signed her own political death warrant. Soren picked up his knife again. He ate in silence, his mind no longer on the woman sitting across from him, but on the true scholar hidden in his secure study, the one who actually understood the weight of the ancient ink. 2 floors below the High Solar, in the restricted royal archives, Marra Sterling was completely absorbed in a different kind of silence. Captain Kalen had locked the heavy oak doors from the outside, ensuring her absolute privacy. The room smelled of dried leather, pressed sage, and crumbling parchment. It was a scent that immediately grounded her, a physical reminder of the life she had lost when her father, Edward Sterling, was executed. The stillness here was the measured, deliberate quiet of accumulated history. A single brass lamp burned steadily on the massive mahogany reading desk. Marra had finished her work on the ceremonial binding. The true translation, along with footnotes exposing the hidden blood-bind clause, rested securely in a sealed leather folio at her elbow, but her mind could not rest. If the Vane family was bold enough to alter the sacred text of a royal union, they had likely manipulated other, less scrutinized records. She opened the territorial tax registry from the year Edward was accused of treason. The pages were thick, rough-edged cotton, filled with the dense numerical columns of grain shipments and iron exports. She ran her index finger down the columns, her raw knuckles a stark contrast against the yellowed paper. At first glance, the arithmetic was flawless. Lord Vane's scribes were meticulous, but Marra read numbers the way an archivist read a structural foundation. She cross-referenced the grain yields of the western provinces against the seasonal weather reports, stored in the adjacent logbook. A discrepancy caught her eye. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and dipped her quill into the inkwell. During a recorded 3-year drought, the Vane territories had inexplicably reported a massive surplus in wheat exports to the Crown, resulting in heavy subsidies. Yet the shipping manifests from the river ports during those exact months showed a drastic reduction in barge traffic. She turned the page of the ledger, her breathing shallow and steady. The error repeated. 10 years later, a supposed blight in the eastern iron mines resulted in a massive royal bailout for Lord Vane. Yet the armory records showed a steady influx of high-grade ore. It was not a simple miscalculation. It was a pattern of quiet, systematic embezzlement, a slow bleeding of the Crown's resources disguised as administrative competence. Marra compared the signatures at the bottom of the falsified pages. They belonged to lesser magistrates, men who had all been promoted or retired to comfortable estates shortly after signing. Her father would have eventually audited these records. He would have seen the structural impossibility of the numbers. That was why he had been framed. He had not been a traitor. He had simply been a mathematician who refused to look away from a broken equation. The realization settled into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. She refused to shed a single tear, knowing weakness had no place in this battle of ledgers. Instead, she methodically transcribed the discrepancies, listing the specific dates, forged signatures, and contradictions in the port manifests. She worked with cold, measured precision. She organized the evidence into clear, undeniable columns, building a fortress of logic that no amount of political shouting could dismantle. By the time the candles burned down to the brass holders, Marra had mapped out 2 decades of the Vane family's quiet land grabs and financial fraud. She closed the final ledger. The heavy thud of the cover falling shut echoed in the empty archive. She wiped a smudge of black ink from her thumb, her posture straightening in the dim light. She was no longer just a hidden maid deciphering a cursed scroll. She was the architect of Lord Vane's destruction, armed with the one weapon he could not bribe, intimidate, or forge, the documented truth. The grand high hall of Ironhold Citadel was a cavern of ancient limestone and vaulted arches, built to dwarf the ambitions of mortal men. On the morning of the solstice, the massive space swelled with the collective weight of the northern elite. Dukes, elders, and barons stood shoulder to shoulder in their ceremonial furs, filling the cold air with competing scents of rich perfumes, polished leather, and nervous sweat. The pre-wedding signing ceremony was the absolute legal anchor before the spiritual binding could commence. At the head of the chamber, raised on a dais of polished black marble, stood Lord Vane. He wore a mantle of midnight velvet, his posture rigid with the unmistakable geometry of a man who believed he had already won. Beside him stood Cynthia, wrapped in heavy silk. Her hands resting on the locked bronze case that held their future, they waited. The great iron bells of the eastern tower struck the appointed hour, rattling the stained glass. The final echo faded into the rafters. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall remained shut. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence in the room began to curdle. What had started as a dignified stillness fractured into a restless murmur. Nobles shifted their weight, the rustle of heavy winter fabrics amplifying in the quiet. Men who had perfectly arranged their expressions of loyalty now checked the wall clocks, exchanging sharp glances. On the dais, the patriarch of the Vane family maintained his confident smile, but the knuckles of his left hand whitened where they gripped his ceremonial cane. Beside the nobleman, his daughter subtly shifted her footing, the heavy jewels at her throat catching the light with an erratic rhythm. Her chin tilted up, trying to project absolute security, but her eyes flicked toward the closed entrance. It was a calculated void. Soren occupied the quiet the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the anxious impulse to fill the silence. He had ordered his guard to hold the outer corridor, watching the minutes tick past on the courtyard dial. He was intentionally allowing the anticipation to sour into doubt. He let the assembled lords feel the absence of their ruler, forcing the architects of the coup to stand isolated under the crushing scrutiny of their peers. When the atmosphere grew brittle enough to snap, he finally gave the nod. The massive oak doors swung inward. The low hum of conversation died instantly. The crowd parted like water breaking over stone. The Alpha King walked down the center aisle with unhurried strides. He did not wear the heavy gold crown of state, nor the ceremonial plate armor expected for a high union. Instead, he wore a simple, dark-tailored tunic and his heavy dire-wolf cloak, the silver clasps gleaming against the thick fur. His gaze did not seek out the bride. He did not acknowledge the strained bows of the councilman. He walked straight toward the dais, bringing the frigid draft of the northern corridor with him, turning the temperature of the room to ice. At the center of the black marble platform, Father Lucan waited behind the sacred altar. The high priest of the grand temple was a man composed of rigid doctrine, his grey robes sweeping the stone floor as he arranged the ritual implements. His movements were usually a seamless choreography, but today his rhythm faltered. He unstoppered the ceremonial vial of ancestral binding ink, the sharp scent of copper and dried herbs blooming into the stagnant air. He set a silver chalice beside it, measuring the distance with unnecessary precision to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. When the king finally reached the altar, the sovereign did not speak. He simply stood there, a towering pillar of stillness, staring down at the empty stone. The priest reached for the heavy weights required to hold the treaty flat. His hands, usually steady enough to transcribe high Fenric script, trembled visibly. The metal clinked too loudly against the marble. Lucan swallowed dryly, carefully stepping back. He had officiated dozens of high unions, reading pack politics through the posture of the leaders before him. A true mating ceremony carried a specific atmospheric charge, a low, thrumming warmth of shared commitment. This room carried none of that. The air around the sovereign felt like the heavy, suffocating stillness before a structural collapse. Lord Vane stepped forward, gesturing for his daughter to follow. Cynthia placed the ornate case upon the altar. The lock clicked open with a sharp snap that made several elders flinch. She withdrew the ancient relic, its aged parchment unrolling with a dry crackle. She smoothed the edges, allowing the priest to place the metal weights on the corners. The ancient text glowed faintly under the high sun shaft. He stared at the unrolled parchment. He ignored the woman across from him, nor did he observe the patriarch hovering at her shoulder. He looked only at the physical document, his dark eyes tracing the lines of the translation he already knew to be a lie. The priest watched the sovereign's chest rise and fall in a slow, measured breath. The silence stretched again, agonizing and absolute. Father Lucan's fingers began to ache from holding the quill mid-air, but he dared not lower his arm. He could feel the cold radiating from Soren's heavy fur cloak, a physical manifestation of authority that required no loud declarations to enforce. The assembly held its collective breath, waiting for the king to sign his name to the marriage treaty. The grand temple remained frozen in suspense, warmed only by the heavy smoking braziers of burning pine. Father Lucan's withered hands continued to hover respectfully over the unrolled historical document. Cynthia stood opposite the Alpha King, her posture a calculated imitation of a reigning Luna, masking her growing panic. Soren did not look at her shimmering silver silk, nor did he acknowledge the nervous murmurs of the vain loyalists. The sharp, bitter scent of elder resin drifted faintly beneath the heavy temple incense, a chemical ghost only his highly trained senses could isolate. Ignoring the offered quill, he finally moved, stepping up to the edge of the polished marble altar. The ancient ritual dictated that he extend his left hand to receive the binding ribbon, offering his wrist to the priest to signify his submission to the pack's oldest law. He did not extend his hand. The silence that followed was not the kind that falls between words. It was the kind that swallows them whole. The entire hall oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a magnetic lodestone. Father Lucan cleared his throat, a dry, nervous sound echoing in the vast, vaulted space but Soren simply raised a single leather-gloved finger to halt the ceremony. Reaching inside the breast of his heavy dire-wolf cloak, the sovereign withdrew a small, torn scrap of ordinary archival ledger paper. From the priest's silver offering tray, he lifted a resting quill. He explicitly avoided the glowing ceremonial cinnabar ink, dipping the nib instead into the standard black iron gall used for basic administrative marginalia. The scratching of the metal nib against the rough paper echoed like breaking ice in the profound, suffocating quiet of the temple. Soren wrote a single line of High Fenric. Carefully, deliberately, he blew the wet ink dry, watching the cold air of the sanctuary instantly chill the moisture into permanence. He slid the scrap across the smooth marble surface of the altar, stopping it precisely at the edge of Cynthia's silver-laced sleeve. "The covenant of the hearth is a profound burden," Soren said. His voice was a low, measured drawl, carrying no edge of malice, only the crushing, unavoidable weight of administrative law. The Vane family has claimed the exclusive honor of its translation, asserting a deep, historical understanding of our oldest legal covenants. Before we bind our bloodlines in front of the witness circle, I ask my bride to demonstrate this devotion. He gestured slightly to the scrap of paper. "Read this one sentence aloud for the court." Cynthia stared down at the black ink on the cheap parchment. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound in the enormous temple was the hiss of the pine resin burning against the granite pillars. The blood slowly drained from her face, leaving her perfect, powdered skin looking like dry chalk against the elaborate metallic embroidery of her collar. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting across the sharp, angular glyphs of the dead language, desperately searching for any recognizable shape, any phonetic anchor she could guess at. There was absolutely nothing. Her lips parted, but her throat offered no sound. She looked up at Soren, her performative arrogance fracturing entirely under the absolute, clinical stillness of his gaze. He offered no prompting, no rescue, and no anger. He merely waited, a sovereign anchored securely in the undeniable reality of physical evidence. A harsh rustle of heavy wool and chainmail broke the tension as Lord Vane stepped forcefully out from the inner witness circle. His boots struck the temple floor with a forced, aggressive rhythm, a desperate attempt to reclaim the shifting geometry of the room before the silence destroyed his daughter's credibility entirely. "Your Majesty," Lord Vane interrupted, his loud, polished politeness failing to mask the sudden, sharp undercurrent of political panic. "This is highly irregular. The protocols of the Solstice Union explicitly forbid testing a bride at the altar. Her work has already been submitted to the archives." Soren did not turn his head to look at the older man. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Cynthia's trembling hands, which were now gripping the edge of the altar as if the stone alone kept her upright. "It is a simple request, Lord Vane. A single spoken line to honor the ancestors before we sign away the military sovereignty of the pack." Vane closed the distance to the altar, his posture rigid and defensive. "The High Fenric dialect is a sacred tongue," he insisted, though the veneer of his untouchable authority was beginning to splinter in front of the assembled lords. A distinct, humiliating crack fractured his voice on the final syllable. "It is far too sacred to be uttered casually by a maiden before the bloodbind is formally complete. To force her to speak it now would violate the deep sanctity of the hearth." As he spoke the lie, Vane's right hand drifted downward, the heavy gold rings on his fingers clinking faintly against the iron pommel of his ceremonial sword. It was an instinctual gesture, the blind reflex of a cornered tactician, realizing that a tiny scrap of paper and a few drops of ink were about to accomplish what decades of border skirmishes could not. Soren finally turned his head. He looked down at Vane's hand resting on the hilt of the blade, and he let that visual evidence settle into the minds of the watching lords, like a heavy stone dropping through still water. You speak of sanctity and tradition, Lord Vane, Soren replied, his tone barely above a whisper, yet carrying with devastating clarity to the furthest arches of the hall. But a law that cannot be read is not a sacred tradition, it is merely a trap. Captain Kalen. Soren's voice cut through the heavy, incense-laden silence of the grand hall, unhurried and precise. The heavy oak doors of the western annex swung open, their iron hinges groaning against the cold stone. The vast assembly of lords, territory commanders, and high scholars turned as one, expecting to see a weathered elder in formal robes of state. Instead, Kalen stepped through the threshold, followed by a woman in a plain, unadorned grey tunic. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, practical knot, offering no concession to the pageantry of the Solstice ceremony. Marra walked into the blinding light of the high hall. She did not wear the spun silk or heavy velvet of the northern elite. She wore the clean-pressed linen of a working servant, smelling faintly of lye and the damp earth of the subterranean vaults. In her hands, she held only a stack of thick, roughly cut parchment sheets, covered in dense, meticulous columns of phonetic breakdowns. The high lords, lining the aisles, murmured in immediate confusion. Velvet rustled as nobles exchanged offended whispers. Some openly sneered, visibly insulted, that a scullery maid had been allowed to cross the sacred threshold during a royal union. Marra did not look at them. She kept her gaze fixed entirely on the text she carried. Her knuckles were still chapped and raw from the freezing water of the sub-cellars, but her posture was flawless. She held the documents the way a seasoned commander held a shield. Not as a defense, but as a weapon ready to be deployed. The weight of 100 hostile stares pressed against her shoulders, trying to force her to shrink. Yet she calibrated her breathing, counting her deliberate steps across the polished marble. Decades of marginalization had forged her composure into unbreakable iron. Now, she simply refused to acknowledge their existence. Lord Vane stepped forward from the front row, his face a mask of furious disbelief. "Your Majesty, what is the meaning of this? Why is a wash girl parading through the Grand Temple during my daughter's binding rite?" Soren did not look at the angry lord. His attention remained on the woman approaching the altar, radiating immovable authority. "This is Marra," the Alpha King said, his tone deliberately devoid of inflection, "daughter of the late Edward, the former Grand Archivist of Ironhold. And she is the only person in this entire citadel who possesses the intellect to read the document your family has placed on this altar." Marra stopped at the edge of the raised dais. She did not bow to the assembly. She simply aligned her notes with the carved stone lectern, her inkstant's fingers resting against her own meticulous work. The air in the temple grew suffocatingly still. "Read the fourth line of the Covenant of the Hearth," Soren instructed. His voice was low, yet it commanded the echoing chamber. "Read it exactly as it is written in the original High Fenric, and then provide the literal translation to this council." Marra looked down at the golden scroll resting on its velvet cushion. She did not need to trace the complex glyphs. She had memorized the curvature of every stroke during the freezing nights in the vault. The original text reads, "Vern Thalok Renfenric, Sila Veth Koros." Her pronunciation was crisp, the ancient syllables ringing against the vaulted ceilings with absolute academic authority. The Vane family translation claims this means, "In mutual protection, the pack endures beneath the sovereign." However, the syntax of the third glyph is inverted, modifying the root verb. She ran a scarred finger millimeters above the parchment, refusing to touch the cursed surface. The literal translation of this structural inversion changes an alliance into a binding command. It reads, "The sovereign surrenders the pack-mind authority to the bloodline of the bride, enduring only as a vassal to her house." It is not a treaty of unity. It is a clause of absolute subjugation. The moment the vows are spoken, the Alpha Command is legally and irrevocably transferred to Lord Vane. The absolute quiet that settled over the grand hall was heavy, pressing down on the assembly like physical weight. Lies! Lord Vane roared, his polished veneer cracking completely as he lunged toward the altar. This is a fabrication, a pathetic forgery invented by a treasonous servant to ruin my house. Father Lucan, you cannot allow this madness to halt a sacred rite. The high priest hesitated, his hands trembling over the ceremonial bowls. Is it a fabrication? Soren asked. He stepped up to the altar, his movements unhurried. He occupied the space without needing to raise his voice, a silent lodestone pulling the entire room's attention. He reached out and tilted the heavy bronze case holding the disputed text so that the midday sun, cutting a sharp angle through the high stained glass windows, struck the surface of the parchment directly. As the parchment warmed under the direct light, the scent of the temple shifted. The sharp tang of elder resin and metallic copper rose into the air. Under the intense solar glare, the ink of the fourth line flared. A deep, unnatural crimson pulse bled through the dark lettering, reflecting a sinister red sheen off the polished marble. Cinnabar ink, Marra stated, her voice steady and clinical, presenting the physical evidence. Forbidden by the First Council, used only in the drafting of cursed blood binds. It reacts to direct solar exposure, a chemical failsafe designed by the ancient scholars to expose covert vassalage. Lord Vane froze, staring at the glowing red letters as his political empire crumbled. Cynthia took a stumbling step backward, her ceremonial veil slipping from her shoulders, her face drained of all color as the irrefutable proof burned beneath the sun. Soren looked down at the golden scroll. He reached across the altar and picked up the ceremonial marriage quill, a sacred artifact carved from the bone of a winter stag. With a slow, deliberate motion that required immense physical strength, the Alpha King snapped the heavy bone quill in half. The sharp crack echoed through the grand hall like a breaking spine. He placed the splintered pieces directly onto the forged covenant of the hearth. There will be no wedding, Soren declared, his voice carrying the cold finality of a falling blade. The alliance is nullified. The contract is broken. He turned his gaze toward the furious, trembling patriarch of the Vane family. Captain Kalen, the king ordered, the quiet authority in his voice, leaving no room for debate. Arrest Lord Vane, Lady Cynthia, and every member of their retinue present in this temple. Hold them in the deep cells for high treason, conspiracy to enslave the crown, and the illegal use of blood magic. The heavy oak doors of the grand temple closed with a final, echoing thud, sealing the heavy silence that had fallen over the high hall. Captain Kalen's guard detail marched Lord Vane and his trembling daughter down the spiraling stone steps toward the deep subterranean holding cells. The faint, rhythmic clank of iron chains faded into the damp masonry, leaving the air smelling faintly of extinguished tallow candles and cold ozone. Soren did not issue loud declarations of triumph or revel in the sudden political victory. He simply lowered his blade, sheathed it with a smooth metallic glide, and gestured toward Father Lucan. He demanded the high registry ledger be brought forward to the altar immediately. The priest, pale and deeply shaken by the exposed treason, hurriedly unlocked the heavy iron clasps of the kingdom's central archive book. Its massive leather cover groaned as it was laid flat across the marble podium. Soren took a long, feathered quill from the ceremonial stand. He bypassed the cursed cinnabar completely, dipping the nib into standard black iron gall ink. With measured, deliberate precision, the Alpha King struck a single, heavy line through the royal decree that had condemned Edward's Erling to death years ago. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the vast chamber. Beside the crossed-out treason charge, the sovereign's handwriting flowed with sharp, calculated authority, entering a full royal pardon and the complete restoration of the Sterling family honours. He reached for the brass melting spoon, poured a pool of golden wax onto the bottom corner of the page, and pressed the heavy thorn signet ring firmly into the center. Marra stood a few paces away, her breath perfectly steady. She did not fall to her knees in gratitude or collapse under the weight of the moment. She simply stepped toward the heavy wooden stand, her gaze dropping to the open page. There, preserved beneath layers of subsequent false administrative entries, was her father's original, meticulous handwriting. Edward's signature, neat and precise, recorded an old grain treaty from a degged prior. She reached out. Her raw, chapped fingers, still stained faintly red from the cellar's forbidden dye, gently traced the elegant curves of the old ink. A single tear fell, slipping down her cheek to land just beside the final stroke of her father's name. It soaked into the thick, aged parchment, darkening the fibrous paper, but the dry ink did not smudge. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Now she wept silently, not from grief, but from the sudden, profound weight of structural justice. The stain on her family's legacy had been permanently erased, replaced by the undeniable physical proof of the royal seal. Soren stepped closer, occupying the silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He watched the tear absorb into the historical record, offering no empty platitudes, simply standing as an equal witness to her quiet vindication. By mid-afternoon, the oppressive chill of the subterranean vaults felt like a distant memory. Soren welcomed Marra into the master study, a high tower sanctuary situated far above the shadow of the lower keep. The room smelled of roasted pine nuts, dry cedar wood, and the faint, sweet steam of fresh chamomile tea resting on a side table. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the space, flanked by floor-to-ceiling shelves, packed with bound administrative manuscripts and unrolled territorial maps. A fire crackled steadily in the wide stone hearth, radiating a dry, enduring heat that pushed back the bitter northern winter pressing against the thick glass windows. The Alpha King stood by the hearth, watching the grey clouds gather over the distant tree line. His heavy dire wolf cloak rested over the back of a cushioned chair. He turned his head slowly as Marra entered. She no longer wore the thin, stained wool apron of an overlooked scullery maid. Instead, she had been provided with the dignified, dark linen tunic of a senior archivist, complete with a silver collar clasp that sat firmly against her throat. Her posture remained upright, defensive yet deeply observant, as she calculated the geometry of this new, elevated space. Soren motioned to the heavy wooden chair opposite his own at the desk. "The lower vaults are permanently sealed," he said, his voice a low, unhurried rumble that carried no aggressive command. "The kingdom requires a grand scholar of the realm. We need a sovereign covenant keeper who reads the truth rather than inventing it to please the court." He did not demand she take the title, nor did he use his pack authority to force her compliance. He simply offered the space, ensuring the boundaries of her autonomy remained entirely intact. Marra approached the desk. She sat down, resting her hands on the solid, polished wood. The warmth of the nearby fire slowly began to thaw the deep, lingering ache in her knuckles, a quiet physical repair after weeks of freezing labor. Soren took his seat on the opposite side of the vast expanse of oak. He reached out and slid a pristine, blank scroll of heavy vellum across the smooth surface toward her. Next to it, he placed a high-quality goose feather quill and an inkwell of pure, uncorrupted black soot dye. They sat in the quiet safety of the high library, two deeply analytical minds separated by a desk, but united by a shared reliance on evidence. Soren did not speak of rushed romantic vows, and he made no sudden move to close the physical distance between them. True sovereignty was not built on biological compulsion. It was built slowly, line by line, on a foundation of undeniable mutual respect. Marra picked up the quill, testing its perfect weight between her fingers. She looked across the table at the man who had seen through her silence. He met her gaze with that same steady, protective calm. The blank parchment before them held no curses and no hidden traps. It offered only the space to write a new future. She dipped the nib into the dark ink, breathed in the scent of cedar, and set the quill to the page.